If you're one of the many people somewhat intimidated with the thought of cross-hatching, well, I've been there too. But the more I play around with it, the more I explore the possibilities with it, the more I'm coming to see the tremendous opportunities that it presents for drawing subjects freehand in pen, which would be very difficult to draw any other way, just with a fine liner. And I think this is particularly true with natural scenes, with drawing nature, where we don't have lots of nice, broad, clean areas, where we have often a huge amount of surface texture and a multitude of edges and types of edges, not to mention complexity in shade and shadow. So in this video, I want to step through using cross-hatching to create very effective effects of nature. Because when we look at a natural scene such as this, there is simply no way we're going to be able to draw all the detail. We have to suggest it. We have to suggest the effect of what we're seeing. And what we're seeing is a lot of very different types of surfaces and edges and shapes, density of these things. We have these steps, we have large rounded boulders, we have smaller boulders, we have vegetation that's close and vegetation that's further away, which create very different challenges for the artist. And we have trees closer and trees further away. We have a little bit of water in the lower left. And we have a great variety, every gradation of white to black. So how do we draw this using a fine liner? Well, we use cross-hatching. But before we can do that, what I find helpful is to get a bare bones outline. I don't want to make this too detailed because a lot of the actual detail will be created more by hatching than by any line work. But I want to, if you like, create the boundaries of some of the major hatching, particularly the hatching I intend to do first, because at that point I need to start to create the values and need to go a bit slower and want to be more accurate. Once I have all this in place, I can then far more rapidly start to move into other areas, referencing off what I've done, both for where I put my marks and for the amount of value I create, the amount of darkness I create from the hatching, and also make choices about what direction I put my lines, because with hatching and cross-hatching, I think it's very important that when we have a very complex scene such as this, that we keep positioning our lines in different ways, both to reflect the form of the objects that we're drawing, but also to separate one area of hatching visually from an adjacent area of hatching. Now, if you want to have a go doing this, I've taken a photo of this when I finish the skeleton stage, and I'll post it on my channel community page. So if you would like to have a go creating this natural scene through cross-hatching, then you'll be able to take a screenshot from there and start at this point that we're on now, where I start my hatching. And at this point it is hatching because I'm not crossing the lines. I start with the steps, partly because they're the easiest place to start. They're straightforward, and I figure it will help me just get my hand in place and my eye in place, but also because they are quite dark areas value-wise in the overall drawing. And while they're not as dark as that central shaded area, I do want to actually make them a bit darker in my drawing than they are in this scene, just to create a stronger focus with the stairs. So you can see I'm doing the two layers of value. And you'll notice, very importantly, as the steps get a bit higher, they're catching the direct sunlight, and so they stay white. Now, these are the areas it's particularly important to keep clean. Any area that I want to be white, I need to work hard to keep clean and need to have a focus that this is an area I mustn't let any line on, and I need to take care with my lines when I'm anywhere near those danger spots. A lot of this hatching will be done very quickly, or else it's never going to get finished. But some spots we have to slow down around. This drawing in real time took me an hour and a half to draw from start to finish, which is about half an hour longer than the longest drawings I usually do for YouTube. Now you can see with the rocks, I'm doing my hatching lines at this point in a rounded form, going around the contours of the rocks to try and represent their form. So I'm trying to have my hatching lines echo the form that lies underneath them. Now, these aren't my final marks in almost any of these spots, except I suppose the white spots. There's a lot of layering that happens over and over again at different stages. Because with value, whether we apply it with ink or wash or with line, with hatching, with value, we read value against the values that are around it. We can't tell if a value is too light or too dark until we start to see the values next to it and in balance or in tension with it across our drawing. Which means we can't finalize any one part until the end. So what I want to do is to get the darker areas done to a degree, and then start to work out what I'm going to be doing with the lighter areas and the areas of more delicate line work. Now I'm using a 0.3mm pen so far because it gives me a thicker, heavier line, which certainly speeds up the hatching process. But I think also for these closer shapes, I want them to have a more robust feel because they are closer. And that means that establishing that in the closer areas gives me the opportunity for the further back areas to use lighter pens and a lighter touch and help create the sense of depth. Now, these leaves here that I'm doing rather heavily and rather boldly are some of the few leaves that I'm going to do where I actually draw the shape of the leaves, because we can see them and they are strong. And if we do a few things such as this in a prominent area, and these leaves are silhouetted against the lighter area in the center left, then that will tell the brain, oh, these are leaves, these must be trees. And therefore the marks that I make that are less exactly leaves, but are still meant to represent foliage, will come across more as foliage than they have a right to be. They'll piggyback on the more exact leaf structure that I've represented in these ones I've carefully drawn. Now, once we get to a further distance back, we can start to use hatching not to represent parts of plants, but the entire plant, particularly shrubs and whatnot. The biggest challenge was the overhanging foliage, the ferns on the extreme right-hand side that come in from the right. I found that was the most challenging part because they're quite close up. And we need to suggest the fact that they're ferns, but we also need to capture the light and the dark. Do that without spending too much time doing it. So now I've switched to a 0.2 to do some detail a bit further back. And you can see that I'm, as you might have noticed me doing some other videos, doing horizontal hatching for the trees, which I find often helps them to stand out more clearly against other marks and lines around them. When we hatch and draw scenes such as this, it's really, really helpful to think in terms of making marks and not lines. If we're thinking lines, then we'll draw lines before we realize what we've done. If we're thinking marks, then we're having to creatively work out all the time, what marks do I make to create the effect of what I'm looking at? It's always about creating the effect of what I'm looking at. And you can see that I've got these two things I'm balancing in my mind now as I going to the areas that aren't as worked. I'm looking at the reference. I'm thinking, just what's the effect of what I'm seeing? I'm not trying to work out what it is even. I don't have to work out what sort of plant it is. I'm thinking, what's the effect? Is the overall effect darker or lighter? Is there an edge here that I need to silhouette in what I do? Is there an area of specific shape that I really need to capture to get a stronger sense of what the plants are or what's happening? And where things are closer, that can certainly be the case. The further back we go, the more the overall tonal values and the general edges become more important than exact representation of the forms. So I've got my 0.3mm pen again, and I'm trying to work out how I'm going to hatch these ferns. So what I decide to do is to create, if you like, a roundedness over this bottom corner to represent the more generalized shape that all of these fronds create. And it kind of links them together to do this curve over this bundle of fronds. And that means then when I do the foliage further back, I can do it in a very different direction that will give separation from these fronds in front. So it's always about choosing directions that create separation. And as you can see, I'm just working back over parts. And as I make some parts darker, it often makes me think, well, now I need to make this part darker. And so I go back to that and make that darker. Now, there are some pretty dark areas up here that I wanted to capture, even though they're not as close as some of the other dark areas. And remember, we're going for effect. We're not trying to draw palm fronds, we're trying to draw the effect of palm fronds. We might have to try and draw a few, not palm fronds, fern fronds. We might have to draw a few, but we don't want to get bogged down drawing individual fern fronds, because then we're going to be in trouble and we'll end up just having to draw so much we'll become overwhelmed. So now I come and work on this lower left rock. And I've got my 0.1mm pen now. So now I'm just doing some light hatching to represent some of the far distant foliage. And I'm doing this as vertical straight lines, or fairly vertical straight lines, just to create a light sense of value in the distance. I'm not trying to do anything more with these marks than represent a tonal area. And so I don't want to make marks that can be mistaken for individual leaves. So it's all about always creating variety of our marks, the shape, the width, the weight, the closeness, all of these things, the direction, all of these things combine together when we hatch and cross hatch. And what we need to do is to combine them in a way that creates the scene that we want, that makes the scene easy to read. Now, when we look at the colour photo, part of what makes it easy to read is the colour. The green for all the vegetation, the blue for the sky, the grey for the rocks, and the kind of murky brown for where there's a bit of water in this almost dry creek bed. But I don't get that luxury drawing with a fine liner. The only way I'll create the ability to see what's happening in this, to distinguish the various components, is through my hatching, through my cross hatching. And yet I also want to preserve the real Australian sense of entanglement when we go in the bush. Our bush is very dense and very prickly. Things come out at you from all sides. And so I want to capture that spikiness as I think about it, and that the overwhelming leaves that often surround us and the dappled effect they create. Capturing that dappled effect both in the leaves and on the ground in shadow is also a focus that I'm trying to hold. So I've covered most of it now. And what I'm doing at this point is starting to look seriously about what parts do I need to darken. So I'm looking at value now rather than shape, rather than form. I'm looking at value. Can I do lines over the top of anything to increase the overall value? And some of these rocks now, I go completely over the top of with another layer of finer lines than what's underneath. And what I do is, by doing that, I darken everything relatively. So the darkest areas still stay darker and the lighter areas still stay lighter, but the overall effect for the whole object is to become darker. Now this is also where I need to be particularly clear of where do I want the sunlight to be preserved, where do I want the white paper. This is where it can be easy when I'm doing lots of adjustments, I've noticed in the past, to just cover over a section that I've managed to preserve right up till the end, which is always frustrating. So I'm still looking at the overall values and just increasing the hatching to increase how they go, how the effect is. So we've pretty much created this entire drawing through hatching. There was really just a bare skeleton there at the start. What do you think? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, cross-hatching can be overwhelming, but I've come to really love it for these natural Australian bush scenes because I wasn't able to draw them effectively in the past. But hatching, cross-hatching, is the key. If I think marks and not lines, and try not to be overwhelmed but go step by step and look for effect, not outline or shape, it seems to be the key. So why not give it a go? But look, whatever you draw and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. Even if it's cross-hatching can be fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.